This video looks at George in chapter 1 of Mice and Men. Now, it's probably traditional to see George as a good character, fundamentally a decent human being, coping with the stresses of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, with the injustice and violence this brings about in wider society. But a deeper analysis would also consider how far he is also violent and compromised by the society around him, so that his actions also can be seen as immoral. And it is this tension between the moral purpose of George and his immoral actions that will lead you to get the highest grades. Steinbeck introduces George and Lenny with some strange military allusions. So they begin, even in the open, one stayed behind the other. This idea of them in single file is a very military image. But look at this, even in the open, as though they're soldiers not just in training, but actually in combat. In combat, you'd line up in the open, if you had to travel across the open, one behind the other, to make it much more difficult for you to be shot. So immediately, George is associated with the world of violence and controlled aggression. This military symbolism, or martial symbolism, is further emphasised by the fact that both are dressed in the same way, with denim trousers, denim coats, which begins to look like a uniform and is then like a military uniform having brass buttons. The alliteration here at the end of the sentence on brass buttons emphasises their military appearance, again suggesting the violence that surrounds them. They also appear to be men of action. Their blanket rolls are rolled tight, as though they are disciplined and ready for instant movement. Again, they're associated not just with violence but with death. So their hats are black, symbolic of death, and they both wear them. Again, typical of a military uniform, each man dressed like the other. Next, we meet George as an individual. He is the first man, a man who is possibly used to doing well. Outside of the Great Depression, he might well have been a success. And he is small and quick, a suggestion that he makes up for his small stature with intelligence, and also then this sinister aspect. He is dark of face, as though capable of evil or disguise. So our first meeting with George is not that of a moral individual. He appears on first meeting, for example, completely unlike Slim. The description continues with a sinister aspect. So he has restless eyes, as though searching for victims, and this is emphasised again by the fact that his features are sharp, suggesting that he's dangerous, and again that strength also suggests that he's dangerous. And then we have this sibilance, the repetition of the S's in restless eyes, sharp, strong features. Sibilance typically reminiscent of that hissing sound that we associate with evil. My videos on symbolism will also show that the setting here in chapter 1 is also very Eden-like, and the role of the snake then here appears to be played by George. He is the one who is going to tempt both himself and Lenny towards evil. At least that's one possible interpretation. Next, we have the introduction of some contradiction. So every part of him was defined. He appears incredibly real. He is strong, a powerful figure. But then set against this in red, I've underlined the features that make him seem weak, small, slender, thin, and bony. So one of the interpretation of this could be to show how he has been reduced by his economic circumstances. Not literally, he hasn't become small because he is poor, although he may well have become thin and bony because of his poverty. And then the final thing that we notice about George in this description is that Steinbeck has deliberately created him to be the opposite of Lenny. And if we take this a little bit further, Lenny is a completely innocent character who doesn't understand evil and nevertheless commits evil acts, whereas George is a highly intelligent character who fully appreciates what is evil, but commits an evil act in killing Lenny in order to save him. And this is the inherent contradiction inside George, that pull between moral behaviour and immoral behaviour for an apparently good purpose. Again, if we consider, as I will in other videos and have done, the religious symbolism of the book, then George becomes an anti-religious figure in many ways, or at least an anti-Christian one. So one way of reading this is him saying to Lenny, God, you're a lot of trouble, to Lenny. But a more subtle reading will also notice that you're a lot of trouble, God. In other words, the subliminal message here is an attack on God. In this reading, God provides their fate, the fate that the title of the novel, Of Mice and Men, is directed at. Their plans gang off to Gley because fate intervenes. No matter how well they plan for success, fate or God steps in and stops it happening, at least here, potentially from George's perspective. The other thing we might notice about George is his dislike of being with Lenny. I could get along so easy without you. I could live so easy. So in chapter 1, Steinbeck already sets up a motive for George getting rid of Lenny. This, of course, would be a deeply cynical reading of why he kills Lenny, but it's nevertheless one we should keep in mind, because he does literally get away with murder at the end of the book. And a final thing you'll notice in this description is this curious ending, and maybe have a girl. So even in the best case scenario that he can imagine, having a girlfriend is not certain. This suggests that George has some deep problem communicating with women, at least where love or sex might be involved. And perhaps this is because he's deeply sexist, as we shall see when he meets Curly's wife. George is also described rather like an actor. So when he tells Lenny about their dream ranch, he repeated his words rhythmically, just like an actor would, as though he had said them many times before, like an actor rehearsing a script. On the one hand, this helps us to view the vision of this dream ranch as an exercise in make-believe, to keep Lenny happy. But it's also an exercise in deception. And there is a sense, perhaps, that George is not what he seems. Perhaps symbolically, Steinbeck uses this description of George's voice becoming deeper to ask us to think more deeply about George and his motives. Steinbeck uses George to introduce perhaps the main theme of the novel when he describes the life of the migrant worker as the loneliest guys in the world. And we can certainly see that in chapter 1, Steinbeck wants us to sympathise with both men, but particularly with George, who can only seem to escape loneliness through his choice of companion in the very inadequate Lenny. George is obsessed with companionship and escaping loneliness, and this is why he contrasts his relationship with Lenny to that of other migrant workers and ranch hands. They, and you get the idea. Completely unlike George and Lenny, and that's picked up here in red. With us, George went on, with us it ain't like that. We got a future, we got friends. And in this repetition we can see a kind of desperation to avoid loneliness and seek out companionship. But you will notice when we get to the final chapter that once Lenny is being killed, George is then free to choose a next companion, and it's perhaps significant that he walks off with Slim. Steinbeck lays the ground for this by making sure that we see George's easy anger in this scene. So he jerks down his hat, he scowls at Lenny, he's easily moved to anger. And once again, he uses blasphemy, taking the Lord's name in vain, if you like, and being anti-Christian. Jesus Christ, you're a crazy bastard. And the expletive here is typical of the unsympathetic way he talks to Lenny. And again, we can look at a more subliminal reading of the line. You're a crazy bastard is directed at this person, Jesus Christ. Again, an anti-religious view. This will become important because the Easter story, if you like, the story of Jesus' crucifixion and then ascension into heaven, is reversed in this novel. So whereas Jesus is crucified on the Friday and then resurrected on the Sunday, in the novel this is reversed. They arrive at this Eden-like state and then the ranch on a Friday, and Lenny is killed on the Sunday, not to be resurrected at all. So the Christian story is deliberately inverted, turned on its head. And with George, this even happens at sentence level, turning this idea of Christianity on its head within the sentence. We are also given unpleasant insights into the rest of George's character. So he is, with Lenny, like an emperor, imperiously. He seems to relish his power over the other larger man, and that man, Lenny, becomes less than a man. In the simile here is described as like a terrier, and the importance of that is it shows how much George enjoys his command over Lenny, and perhaps how damaging it is to Lenny, even though, and this is where the contradiction is, it's for Lenny's own good. George's role here is to be the master of the subservient dog. And this imagery certainly calls into question George's motives. Does he really need to be quite so harsh? Does he really need to have such control? And the next description is possibly designed by Steinbeck to make us actively dislike George. George snapped his fingers sharply. Again, the sibilance here of snapped fingers sharply suggests how sinister and perhaps evil George is being toward Lenny. And so our sympathies start to move away from him. Next, George's anger erupts. George exploded over an incredibly trivial request from Lenny for ketchup. Look at what happens to the language here. This is the we of companionship that George seemed so keen on just a few pages before, but look at what that becomes. I. Complete self-interest, completely overcoming his desire for companionship with Lenny. And once again that calls into question just how far George wants Lenny's companionship. Most interpret this as a moment of frustration for George, of constantly having to look after Lenny and constantly losing his job because of what Lenny does. In other words, we sympathise with him. But underneath that, his anger also reveals his true self. And his true self here perhaps is one that wants to be without Lenny. And at the end of the novel, his dream comes true. Again, that's a cynical way of looking at George's relationship, but the language analysis here also suggests that it's It's a way of reading that you could justify if you wanted to. And then George expresses very neatly his motive for getting away from Lenny. When I think of the swell time I could have without you, I go nuts. And this addition here of I go nuts shows how desperate he is to get rid of Lenny. On the other hand, of course, we can use this to sympathise even more with George, because despite the fact that he's so desperate to get away from Lenny, he redoubles his efforts to keep Lenny safe and with him. In other words, he sacrifices his own happiness for Lenny's. And then Steinbeck seems to change the mood again, with George apparently feeling guilt. I've been mean, ain't I? He says, apparently regretting it to Lenny, so that we come to sympathise more with George and see him as more self-aware. The chapter then deliberately ends with humour, so that we are left with a better image of George. So there is a joke shared with the reader here when Lenny asks for different colour rabbits, and George replies, sure we will, red and blue and green rabbits, millions of them. But if we wanted to take an alternative interpretation, we might think that Lenny could take this at face value. He might actually expect these different coloured kinds of rabbits. In other words, George is practicing another kind of deceit on Lenny, knowing that Lenny will eventually be disappointed when these colour rabbits cannot appear. Similarly, the last lines he speaks to Lenny can be read humorously. You can just as well go to hell, shut up now. But if we look at the language in more detail, we can see a different interpretation offers itself. You can just as well go to hell, again picking up that anti-Christian feel. George condemning Lenny to hell. And a strictly Christian reading of the novel would say that's exactly what happens. Lenny murders Curly's wife, has committed a mortal sin, and then George kills him. Lenny's soul will therefore go to hell if we take a Christian view of the novel. And we can read this shut up now as final impatience with Lenny. George has had enough and now wants to get rid of him. Yes, these are the words of a tired man, and we don't have to see anything sinister in them, but alternatively we can, if we choose, decide to see him as finally deciding he's had enough of Lenny and wants to get rid of him once and for all. So there you have it. Steinbeck deliberately presents George as a deeply complex character, one full of Christian symbolism because he becomes a kind of anti-Christian figure, and one whose actions we are unsure how to interpret. Is he basically a good person struggling to get by in difficult circumstances, or has he become evil in nature and exploiting his relationship with the more innocent Lenny?